more of a seminar format, so we reduced the number of people, and we didn't actually advertise this first one as well as perhaps we might. Something we'll discuss next week about the next one. So what I'd like to do really is to begin by inviting Nicola Davis, who's our head of collections and also the person responsible for putting this sequence of seminars together, just to say a few words about the seminars, about the collections and what's been going on. So
thank you, Chris. Yeah. Well, as Chris said, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of collections at the Royal, which means I've the operational responsibility for the library, museum, including the archives. This event was originally supposed to be a full-day symposium for philatelic libraries and those interested in them, that was due to take place during London 2020. I mean, now that's been postponed until February 2022. We thought it'd be nice to do a few events to keep the momentum and get together and talk about issues relating to libraries and collections and philatelic research. We've got a few more planned. Ari, he's up next in 2 weeks' time, and he'll give us a case study about the research that went into the book they published. Was it 2 years ago? I'm not sure.
2016.
And the work that they did, and open access as well will be something that Ari will be talking about, and how that could have made the research a bit easier perhaps. But I'll leave Ari to discuss that one. And then 2 weeks later, Bruno, who I don't think's here, he'll be telling us all about his institute in Italy. Charles, who is on the call, on the 9th of July, will be running us through everyone's favourite topic, copyright. And those of you who have seen Charles's talk in Stockholm will know what they're in for. And then 23rd of July, Victoria Stevens, who's the conservator that's doing work on our Perkins Bacon archive. She's been working on them during the lockdown and doing some footage for us and taking pictures as she's gone along, so we'll be able to see the work that she's been doing on our delivery books. So yeah, that's all I've got to say for now. This first one was really just a bit of a test run, and we were going to promote it on the website and everything, but the tickets went really quickly before we could. So the rest, as of this morning, are all on the website. They're on our Eventbrite page, so feel free to book. And then back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think what we might actually have to think about is overbooking, taking a leaf out of Ryanair and booking 65 or 70 to get a 50 turnout. But we can talk about that next week when we have our review. The other thing I would say is we're always willing to hear comments from anybody who's attended one of these. And you just need to send an email to rom@rpsl.org.uk. So anything that anybody has to contribute will be gratefully received and possibly ignored.
Sorry, I think the other thing I'd just say is that the idea behind having smaller numbers is so we could interact with each other, and it's not going to be just Frank talking at us. It's going to be more of an interactive, engaging experience.
Well, what Frank has done is he's put in several slides which request interruptions, but we'll come to that in due course. The other person I'd like people to meet is Tony Bard, who's the editor of the LP, and I'd like him just to introduce himself and say a few words about the LP. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Based on my immense experience of editing now, which is 5 editions, which have gone from tortuous, basically floundering in typefaces and all sorts of things. But thanks to the input of my LP sensei, Frank, I'm getting near to sort of actually being able to breathe air. And there is a chance that the June issue, which is in theory being printed as we speak, may actually not have too many embarrassing things hidden in it. But I'm sure Frank will let me know, and various other attendees today will leap at the opportunity. So I'm sort of paused for the reaction. Anyway, but no, I think this is a great opportunity. I would like to thank everybody who's been putting the word around in terms of getting more contributions. I won't reveal how many contributions I have in the pipeline at the moment, but let's just say that given the situation when I took over this role, I have a lot more to publish than I did at that point, even though there may be fewer actual contributions. So I'm positive, but I think one of the things that we should really have appended to the invitation, which might have reduced the number of attendees, is that if you're going to attend, you've got to ensure that you send in a contribution, either the easy way in, which is the story behind the cover, which has proved to be quite successful, or a full article, otherwise you can't attend. But on the basis that that would probably reduce the numbers to about 5, I'd just like to do exactly what everyone else is doing and say, please, because that's the lifeblood of the LP. Obviously, at the moment, the Gazette side of things is slightly thin. These sort of reports, which we'll be doing on both this specific series of display of presentations and, let's say, the more traditional presentations online. There'll be 2 in the June issue. Those will continue, but in the interim, we've got some space to make up, and that in turn ties in with the discussions that have been had in Publications Committee, which was something we were going to look at later in the year, which was trying to get some sort of consensus and input as to how the readership would like the LP to look and be going forwards. But that's for a later date, and I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks very much indeed. I think it's probably time to bring Frank in. It's supposed to be 2:05, it says on my very elaborate schedule that I've got from Mike. I don't think there's any truth in the rumour that the front cover of the LP is about to go full colour and be in cartoon form. But we'll see what happens, and be interested to know what people think. Frank Walton needs no introduction, so I'm not going to give him one. And so, Frank, if you'd share your thoughts with us, we'd be very grateful. Thanks very much.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen? Just nod if you can.
Yes, Frank.
That works nicely, thank you. Okay, the title page. It's intriguing that, as you'll see in a few slides' time, the title really hasn't changed since 1892, which I think is sort of rather quirky. And the banner heading you're seeing there was actually taken from an LP in the 1890s. The only significant difference, there's a spot the difference form here, but of course the word Royal is missing. And prior to 1906, we were just called the Philatelic Society, London, full stop. And of course, we're no longer there. But anyway, so that's what that one's all about. Right, what we're going to see today. I was practicing this with Mike and Chris and 1 or 2 others. And we decided what we're trying to do is break this down into various sections. So I'm going to do 3 basic chapters of my talk. The first one is the background and how we got to where we are. And at that point, I shall pause. And if nobody's got anything to say or ask me, then we'll move on. Next thing I'm going to talk about is what an LP article actually is all about. You know, how do we go about structuring one? And finally, we're going to talk about the actual nitty-gritty of how it should be presented and how we do scanning effectively and all the rest of things. So pauses at the end of each chapter. Let's catch our breath and catch up. But I'm afraid I've got a major advantage over most of you in that I've seen this before, like yesterday when I wrote it. So what I really do want to do is make this an interactive session, and please feel free to interrupt me. If you want to, if you've got a burning question on the tip of your lips, just interrupt, and I'll be delighted to try and answer it if I can. The Royal has got a very successful publications history, but of course what we recognised really from day one in the 1870s, it started earlier. Research comes in different sizes, and we've got 4 different ways you can do things. First of all, we've got handbooks, you know, traditional hardback books with covers, monographs are smaller books, LP articles, and then occasionally we have an LP supplement, but we don't actually do too many of those. So what does a handbook look like? There we go, between 150 and 4,000 pages. I made those numbers up, but basically I think the smallest hardbound book on my shelf with the Royal imprint is just over 150 pages. And of course, in fact, those of you who recognise my bookshelves, just about there is actually the De La Rue collection book, which was about 3,500 to 4,000 pages. So, you know, there is really no upper limit. And the 2 blockbusters we've just published, one is available, which is Jamie Goff's, and the next one is James Grimwood Taylor's book on postal reform. In theory, that was meant to be printed by tomorrow and bound by tomorrow and available by tomorrow, but whether it will be, I'm afraid, is in the lap of the gods. They're handbooks. Monographs are smaller books. These are typically like the ones that Vincent West has been doing. Essentially, they're too big for the LP. So if you write a story which is 80 pages long, we can't put that into the LP. That's not what the LP is for. But nevertheless, the Royal is still very keen to publish original research. And what we will do is produce a softbound book. Generally, it's digitally printed rather than done by lithography. And they do sell very well. And, you know, we are very proud of that heritage as well. So, London Philatelist. There's 5 front pages there, and I think the great Sir Edward Denny Bacon, or even Marcellus Castle back from the 1890s, would actually recognise the front cover today as it was back in 1892. Is that good or is it bad? Well, I did run a little group of people asking for their thoughts about the shape of the LP when I first took over about 20 years ago now. And everybody said, well, look, just recognise, Frank, that you are not competing on the top shelf of a newsagent's for people to come and pick up your magazine and buy it. What we want the magazine to say is, this is real, this is a journal of record, this is important. We're not competing for sales. So the kudos or the gravitas, to use 2 complicated words, about what the LP is all about, we didn't want to change that. And of course, it is in the editor's gift. And if Tony wants to run another little focus group and everybody says, no, 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 we need a photograph of the last president handing over a medal to somebody on the front cover, so be it. We need to move with the times. But in essence, we've never been brave enough so far. Just on the screen here, you can see the word Royal creeps in around about the second one on that page. So, first published 1892. We're currently in the 129th volume. It's never stopped. If you look on the front cover, it gives you a whole number, which is a sequence number. And the current edition is issue number 1475. And the mathematicians in you will scratch your heads and say, well, actually, there's only 1,356 different editions if you collect a full set. And the answer is that in the 70s, we actually moved to only 6 editions a year. And we actually allocated 2 numbers. So why we did that, I'm afraid you'd have to ask the editor at the time. But there's a significant number of copies of the LP with 2 whole numbers on the front page. So we're actually there's now a discrepancy between the 2. Tony Barr's the 12th editor. I did ask Tony to send me a photograph. And I foolishly actually wrote the words, would you send me your favourite photograph, Tony? And that's actually the one he sent. So when I thought, yeah, let's move on. Intriguingly, I actually tried to work out how many different authors have ever written an article. And essentially, there was a very easy way of finding this out, on the grounds that we do have this wonderful thing called the LP archival edition. And what that has got associated with it is a fantastic database of one article in the LP has one row in the database. So you can actually quite easily run some SQL against that if you've got access to it. And I can tell you that almost 1,200 different people have actually written major articles. That excludes things like obituaries and book reviews. These are actually proper philatelic articles, if you understand what I mean by that. And there are nearly 5,000 different articles over 120 odd years. Very large number of pages. I won't say I've looked at every one, but I have to say I've probably flicked through most of them. And that gives you the citation. So, of the nearly 1,200 different authors, one guy actually has written over 100 different articles. They're fantastic. This guy's my hero, Sir Edward Denny Bacon. You know, he was the guy who wrote the fantastic book on GB line engraved stamps, published in 1920 or thereabouts, and it's taken 99 years for that book to be replaced. This is the one that Alan Druce wrote about 2 years ago now. And Sir Edward Denny Bacon, one of my fantastic heroes of the world. The Royal would be a sadder place without him. And indeed, the latest medal the Royal gives out for honorary fellowship is named after this guy. 5 people have written over 50 articles, and according to the data, 31 have written over 20. So, you know, that still leaves an awful lot of people who have written a large number of articles. Right, that's the first pause point. Let's just go over the history of the LP. I don't suppose anybody's got any major there, but if you do, shout now or I shall press on.
Frank,
yep.
Richard Berry. I think one of the, was it May 1937, they put a picture of the coronation stamp on the front of the LP, so they do put pictures on the front sometimes.
You are exactly right. And if you want to be talking, I think there are, from memory, there are 3 or 4 examples of that. For example, when the big London international shows have been up, sometimes there's been photographs on the front of those. So you are exactly right, and I will correct the slides next time I give the deck.
Yeah, Frank, just Frank. On that.
Oh, stop.
Sorry, Charles. Just on that, Frank. The issues that were done for Stockholmia, didn't they have illustrations on the front cover as well?
They did. In fact, all the supplements have.
Frank, I just wanted to ask, during the Second World War, was publication of the LP in any way interrupted?
No, it carried on actually. Although what did happen, the number of copies printed got a lot smaller because people weren't in the UK, or indeed anywhere in the world. Membership declined. I'm afraid there was a lot of political shenanigans, and people from certain countries who were at conflict with the UK did actually get debarred from membership. But the number of pages reduced because of the paper shortages, and more importantly, the quality of the paper which went down. And anybody who happens to have copies of the LP in the 1940s and also the First World War, they will notice that the paper has gone terribly browned and is very brittle. And there are many people, in fact, I can tell you Chris Harman, who many people know, he's got a full set of LPs apart from the early 1940s. He's never been able to find second-hand copies of the 1940s LPs. You can buy a complete set of the LPs if you want to at some quite modest price now, but trying to get old ones of the 1940s to complete a set is a bit tricky. A bit like Wisdons, if anybody knows what that means. Okay, I'll press on. I mentioned the phrase a journal of record. The LP is normally kept. If you have I don't know how many people are sitting in front of their bookcases, but I know from my own visiting of members that they generally got a bookshelf of LPs since they became a member. And, you know, people do keep the LPs because they like to go back and look at them again. And the Journal of Record is publishing articles which are not for just for today, but they're there for recording for posterity. And I frequently go back using the LPR indexes, of course, and find references to material which I didn't know was ever written. And sometimes these guys back in the 1800s, well, they were there. And if you wanted to try and work out when the first overprints of Sierra Leone hit the market in 1897, well, there is actually an account in the LP. So, you know, these things are there, and people do go back and constantly listen to them, which is super. We generally strive in the LP only to publish what I call authoritative articles. In other words, these are articles which have got some deep meaning to them. People have written and wanted to publish the conclusions of their detailed research into any particular sphere. This was a key mantra, and I have to say I think this is still true today. The LP will never publish anything that has been published anywhere in the world before. We do allow people to repeat an article in a specialist magazine after it's been in the LP, but we generally don't do it the other way around. There are one or two exceptions to that, particularly if it's been published in a foreign language first. So in other words, I would actually caveat that sentence by saying only includes research not published in English elsewhere previously. So sometimes we will take English translations. But of course, the people on this call are experts in their field. Most members of the Royal know more about one narrow field than anybody else in the world. It really is true. So who writes articles? And I rest my case, my lord. I'm going to challenge everybody on this call to just reflect. I'm going to pick on David Orford because I'm seeing him in the corner of my screen here. David is one of the world's leading experts in Fiji. And I bet you David knows a damn sight more about Fiji stamps than probably anybody else on this call, unless John Ray happens to be on, I don't know. But if you know, David's found something new in a particular research area in Fiji, then of course people in the Pacific Island Study Circle would love to hear it. But I bet you there's some people who would like to see the same thing in the LP as well. The other thing I've learned over the years is that most people in the Royal really do want to share their knowledge. You know, it's part of our charitable status is to actually try and share knowledge and educate people. That is why we are a charity. And part of that is all about publishing original research. So, you know, if we want to continue to receive the massive tax breaks we get from the British government, then we do need to continue to educate people. We are an educational charity, and that's what it's all about, sharing knowledge. Let's think of, the reason I came up with this slide, I actually went back and looked at the articles that had won the Toppling Medal. The Toppling Medal is awarded once a year for the best article in the previous 20 issues of the LP. In fact, Tony Bard won the Toppling Medal back in 1946, wasn't it, Tony? It was a long time ago. I'm sure Tony will correct me. It would have been, oh, I don't know, around about 2000. I'm making that up when Tony won the medal. So
2014, actually.
2014, never.
Yeah, it was that recent.
Oh,
yeah.
Gosh, okay, I apologise. The point is, I went back and looked at the Toppling winning articles, and this is sort of generalising what a successful article on the LP is all about. It's basically substantial in length. It's not just half a page or a page and a half. It's a bit meatier than that. It's got brand new information in it that we haven't previously seen anywhere in the world. And it is very deep. This is not something you'd expect to find in Stanley Gibbons Part 1, for example. It goes beyond that. And this is what the LP is greatly, well, we're very well positioned to publish. And needless to say, all the best articles have normally got a fantastic set of illustrations which make people want to read it. One of the great challenges of being an editor is to give a balanced edition. So the epitome of a great issue of the LP that lands on your doormat would have something in it of most of these categories. You know, more and more we're seeing articles on postal history contributed, but we do like stamp articles. I mean, Joe Mowbray put a very nice article, was it last issue or the one before, on the GB Tuppenny Blue. But we don't get too many articles on thematics and revenues, and we would love to have them, but what is published is only what we're given. The other thing which I know I used to strive for, and Tony would love to do the same again, is have a geographical balance of content. So some European articles, some South American articles, something from Australia, Malcolm, something from America, etc. So if we can have an LP which has got a spread of geographic interest and also a spread of type of article, then that would be the great thing we ought to strive for. It makes a more interesting read as well. Language, it's written in English. Well, actually, it's written in English. Apologies to Charles and Scotsman, but we very often would for example, rewrite something that's been written in American English specifically for the UK market. And that is consistent, it always has been, and we do strive to continue with that. The editor is called an editor. What does that mean? Well, it is the editor's job to actually try and avoid egg-on faces, and they will correct grammar and spelling, often without actually recourse back to the author. I used to make very small changes without actually going back to say, put a comma in here, or I'll change the word colour to say colour, and those sorts of things. So minor changes will be made by the editor. But of course, more than half the membership of the Royal is not English, or not British, sorry. So what we do have is a very special route into the LP through Tony to actually assist converting somebody who's writing in their non-native language to actually improve the quality of the written English. And that's there for anybody's help. I know sometimes I've had a couple of Chinese authors who have got fantastic material to share with us, but it did take quite a little bit of time to actually get the structure of the sentences into something which made sense to everybody. And that's what the editor does as well. Mike pointed everybody to a couple of areas on the website. There is one there. I could click on that now, but I'll leave you to do that in peace. Basically, it's the style guide. The word guide is important. These are not rules, but on the other hand, it does give the LP, and indeed all of our books, a commonality of best standards. And that 16-page document will tell you all about how we phrase things, what dates look like in the articles, etc., etc. So if you are contemplating writing an article, by all means write it in the first place, but if you actually have a look at that, then it will give you a clue as to the sort of things that we're really trying to avoid people falling into holes. Few tips. Always write an introduction. The best articles have got subheadings. There's nothing worse than turning a page of an LP and having two entire pages of prose without any illustrations, without any subheadings. It just makes it difficult to read. So break down the topic if possible. Write in short sentences and avoid long words. Yes, why that? Because don't forget that more than half the membership is not English. And very often, although Americans and Australians, etc., do make up a good number of those, many people are reading in their second language. And if you can use plain English, then it is much easier to achieve your goal of actually getting other people to understand what you're writing. And I think that's really important. And to my mind, being understood is far more important to let people think that, gosh, you're clever, which is what I'm trying to say in that last bullet point. A few tips. Oh, that last one is a real problem I've got. I finally caught out David Beach, past president, who I'm sure many of you will know. He's a brilliant author, very, very fastidious in what he writes. But I once caught him out because it was around 2001 when he wrote something for me. And he said, in the last century, people did I said, well, hang on a minute, David, what do you mean? Which century was he talking about? And it makes my point here that, you know, if you just write things such as the examples on that screen, bearing in mind that the LP will be on people's bookshelves 30, 40, 50, 100 years later, we really need to know when you're talking about. This one's a massive problem, and I'm sure I'm not going to educate you too carefully here. The LP style guide says you write out dates in full. In tables you can make it a bit shorter, but 3, 6, 20, what does that mean? Is it the 3rd of June, the 6th of March, 1920, 1820? You can see where I'm going. So we do have style guidelines that say always write it in full. That way you can never be confused, or rather never confuse your reader, which is more important. When you start putting your fingers on the keyboard, what do? Well, the vast majority of people nowadays use Microsoft Word. I believe in my immediate philatelic circle of friends, I've only got 2 who regularly use Macs, one of whom's on this call. It does sometimes cause a bit of confusion when your file name structures are different, etc. But basically, if you use Microsoft Word, DocX is ideal, but you can use Mac format and it does work just as well normally. Or if you don't want to write it in a Word document, you can just type it into an email. The editor would be delighted to hear from you. Remember I was talking earlier about the style guide and the standardization? Don't worry about things emphasizing the text because the editor will see what you've written and he will actually convert it into the standard style. Many people nowadays put far more quotation marks in than normal. People very often nowadays use quotations for colloquialisms. I'm using bad language now because people might not know what I mean. But if people want to give a word which is sort of got an implied meaning, they'll very often put it in quotes. And generally speaking, that's not English best style. Equally, I'd say many people will put capitals all over the place. I know it's standard in the German language, but not in English language. So the editor will take those sorts of things out, but don't worry about it. And also don't worry about pagination. The LP is actually a completely non-standard page size. It's whatever paper they used back in 1892. And every edition of the LP is exactly the same page size today as it was back in Castle's day. It doesn't fit any metric European size, it doesn't fit any American letter sizes, it is a unique page size. So if you're writing and expecting to get your article onto a certain number of pages, it won't happen. So again, the editor will be responsible for the pagination. This is really important. When we try and work out why the LP is different to other philatelic journals, it is because we care. It is because we are trying to write learned articles. It is because we are, to use that phrase, a journal of record. And if people are actually citing a reference, we need to know what that reference is. It's no good to say there were 27 plate 11 penny blacks known. Well, what does that mean? Where did you get that information from? And you need to declare your source. And you can normally do that by putting a footnote. And footnotes and endnotes, if you don't know the difference, ask Tony and he'll reply. What I'm looking for here is just telling you how to cite a reference. So if you are referring to, I don't know, something in the Dullaroo archive, and you need to give a page reference back to the book where you saw the illustration, because somebody might, reading that article, want to go and check. They want to go and see what the nuances are of what you're actually writing about. And I have to say, people do go back and check your primary sources because they might want to go back into more depth of a particular area that was just on the side of what you were writing. So people do go back and check. And if you give them the references, you can't go wrong. And again, the editor will sort out the references. All assertions should be clearly stated. I once had an article which I actually rejected. I rejected very few articles. I won't embarrass the person involved, who's not actually any longer a member of the society, by the way, so it won't be on this call. But he wrote an article. It started off by saying, "The Royal's expert committee have got this wrong." That was his first sentence. And I wrote back to him saying, well, look, why don't you start the sentence with something along the lines of, "New evidence has come to light that I believe suggests that the Royal Expert Committee has got this wrong." In other words, he started off with a very bold assertion without giving any justification for it whatsoever. And that tone carried on over 8 pages. And I suggested to him that he might want to tone that down a little bit and actually put that he believed that rather than just quoted it as a desperate fact. And he got really upset. He took the article off us because I rejected it anyway. It then turned up in an American magazine, and guess what? The American editor said exactly the same to him as I did. And it actually appeared in the American magazine with all the caveats in, which I thought was actually quite amusing at the time, but never mind. So if you are going to state something that isn't definitely obvious, then you must say where you're getting your evidence from, and also say that you believe that, not give it as a direct fact. Best practice. Pause time.
Okay, Frank, there's been a couple of questions. Markand asked about digital pipeline. Does he want to ask that question? Or do you want to pick that up from chat? What he's asked
in the chat, so.
Okay, what he said is there a digital pipeline to convey a message to the author once an article's been submitted? So how do you know where your article is if you just passed it off?
Generally, having gotten over the balancing act right at the beginning of my tenure, what I'm trying to do now is firstly acknowledge receipt of the article. I then tend to do a pre-edit, a read through to see how much work might be involved, whether, more importantly, I believe it's suitable for publication, because there are a number of submissions that are received which are so general that the LP is not the place, and I try and break that as gently as possible to people, or if it's obviously something that I may have seen or whatever. So that's stage one, is acknowledge receipt. Then is a question of going through some of the technicalities just to get everything, all the ducks in a row. One of the other questions that came up was about peer review. Now, so far with regards to peer review, my litmus test has been who the author is and what I know about the author and what people within the society I speak to know about the author. I mean, for example, I was at a loss to know who to get to peer review Jane Mowbray's article on the basis that I would have asked her. It doesn't always work out that way, as we will come to see with regards to one or two articles that have escaped. And you will remember that last year there was the Witu scenario with certain things, certain statements made by the author which were contradicted or queried, etc. But that's also dialogue. So going back to the digital pipeline, I get the article. If it's going to go to peer review, then we have a situation where because the peer review itself is a favour, I can give nudges, but essentially if I want the peer review, then I'm going to have to wait until it's actually been completed. And Frank referred to it before, is when the article is written by somebody who does not have English as their first language, there are all sorts of angles that need to be looked at and applied. I am actually about to, I believe, I hope, finalise an article which was actually submitted during Seju's tenure and has taken this long to actually bring to a state where I actually think it may appear in July, August. So, but I've kept in touch with the author, and there's been various dialogue there. Depends. I mean, it all depends ultimately on the raw material. If the raw material turns up, as I've had in the last couple of months, where I really all I've got to do is typeset it. It's fantastic that the illustrations themselves are the correct resolution. The article itself needs little or no editing per se. Then, as far as I'm concerned, that's going to go to the top of the publication queue because it can. And I, especially at the moment where I've got these extra pages to fill, you know, that's it. But yeah, I mean, it's quite right, because there's nothing worse than actually submitting something that you've worked on and represents a stage in your own research, your own hobby, your own enjoyment, where you want to share it, and then you hear nothing. Not going back to the days where I think the first time I actually submitted an article, the editor used to send postcards out. I think it's great. I think it's something I am considering actually reinstating once the postal service gets back to normal, because the one thing we don't do is actually do very much to further modern philately, and I think it's under advisement. I take that my own suggestion under advisement. But yeah, keep people informed, and hopefully, you know, the actual delay shouldn't be too long. The other thing that does come into it as well, and there are some articles which have been submitted, which I've got in my to-do list as such, is that there are some areas of collecting which are fantastically active in terms of publication. And quite often it's the smaller the area that generates the great number of articles. And one area there is Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, where for some reason I think there's a lot of obsessive philately going on as far as that country is concerned. And there's a most stunning article that was apparently submitted during Steve Jarvis's time, right? And I've seen the PDF, but how many articles on Saint-Pierre-Miquelon can one realistically publish if, as Frank was saying earlier, in an ideal world, what we publish would actually reflect our membership and their interests. And therefore, it will appear, but I couldn't, I said to the author, fantastic article, but I'll let you know. I'll let you know when I can sneak it in. So yeah, in answer to Mark, and yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Tony. A very quick following question. Like nowadays, we have the Zoom meetings, and in the Zoom meetings, we have the declaration. Like, say, for example, I'm a speaker on 4th June, and I have to fill the declaration form, blah, blah, blah. When I'm putting an article, do we practice this thing? To have the declaration form, the images what are being sent and which are going to be included in the article belongs to the author. Yeah, well that's one thing I don't know whether Frank's actually going to mention it, is there is now a publication license. Now that does cover to an extent, and I don't know whether it's been Oppenheimed or not. But the idea being is that, you know, you're basically saying it's your own work, and that if it isn't, you actually acknowledge the sources, the illustrations. Again, if not from your collection, where are they from? Do you have the right, or you know, the copyright holders agreement where one can get that agreement? And primarily, it tends to focus on an author's intellectual property, so that you've written an article, you know, it may well be that another journal wants to publish it. We don't really put up too many barriers to that, apart from wanting to actually have the LP as the journal of record being acknowledged as the original site of publication. And that's something that goes out to all authors to acknowledge and to essentially agree to. Yeah.
I do have a slide or two on that coming up, actually.
Right. Delete that from the recording then.
Okay, shall I carry on?
Well, there's, Frank, may I just jump in there if I could? Roger Johnson made a mention that you know you were listing in the references the things that should be included, so to help people find the documents that you've referenced. He said in the case of things that have been given international standard book numbers, you should obviously quote the ISBN as well.
We don't tend to do that, funnily enough, because the vast majority of books that are cited will be in the Royals database, and you can search for them there.
What we do is we follow standard publishing practice. The ISBN is never quoted in a reference to standard format journals or books.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
It's usually author, title, publisher, date, place of publication. And then after that, there are page references or chapter references or whatever's appropriate.
Frank?
Yeah.
A couple of points, if I may. With regard to first issue of an article, I think we decided in the Publications Committee last time that that wasn't absolutely necessary, particularly given Tony's lack of articles. That's the first thing, if I may. Secondly, it applies mostly to books, and that is, please do actually check the publications guidelines, particularly with the use of Word and images, because we've had all sorts of trouble with low quality images.
I've got some slides coming up on that, David.
Okay, and if I may, just a minor point, you mentioned about SG articles not being terribly good, but I can assure you there's a very, very good one on Fiji, which was published, I think, in December of last year.
I take that on the chin.
and sorry, but equally, I have to apologise because I'm going to have to go shopping in about 5 minutes' time.
I'll talk faster. Okay.
Thank you.
Can I move on, Mike?
Frank.
Thank you.
Frank.
Yeah, I won't move on.
Frank, just one question from Mike Roberts. How do you check whether the research has been covered before? Because that was one of your points about.
How do I check what, sorry?
Whether the research has been covered before.
I've got an extended version of that question. We can either take it now or at the end.
Go on.
Well, it was about plagiarism, and I mean, how far would you say that plagiarism is an issue, and reliance on, too heavy reliance, if you like, on secondary sources, both in the LP and in philatelic writing in general?
Generally speaking, certainly I talk from my own period in the editor's chair, I used to trust the author. Most people who are writing for the LP are members of the Royal and do really understand what it's all about. And they would not claim somebody else's work as their own. In fact, if anything, it goes the other way around. What is often published in the LP is actually plagiarized elsewhere later. Of course, it's an issue, but generally speaking, in my experience, people are only ever repeating material that was perhaps published 80 years ago. And there are very few people who were actually reading the LP 80 years ago who are still going to read the new issues. It is very dangerous. We were chatting a couple of days ago, Chris, about primary and secondary sources. My own view is that if you can ever go back to a primary source, in other words, a copy of the Perkins-Bacon archive, it's far, far more important than quoting Alan Drews's transcription of it. You know, Alan Drewes has got an amazing attention to detail, but that doesn't mean to say you can take it as gospel. And you know, you as an author of a major article, you really ought to go back and check your primary sources. And if you are citing a reference in an LP article to the number of penny blacks printed from plate 11, then I would much rather you quoted the primary source in the Perkins-Bacon archives rather than Alan Drews's summary of it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to Alan Drews's book, he will cite the original primary source. And that's really the most important facet here. Any brilliant article in the LP, which is going to win the Toppling medal, for example, will go back to primary sources. It will not quote secondary sources. Secondary sources are a great way in. You know, we've all got books on our shelves, and anything I pull off one of the books behind me is by definition a secondary source. And what you're looking for in the learned handbooks is pointers back to the original archives, if at all possible. So is it a problem? Yes, it is. But generally speaking, I'm very proud of the fact to be associated with a society such as the Royal, where people understand this, and they will not generally write articles which are just reworks of previous authors. You're not adding much value if you do that.
I think the other thing, just adding, Frank, if I may, is the, I mean, a lot of it, where there is a potential plagiarism, one would think that a peer reviewer may well pick it up. Now, we are not short of potential peer reviewers for GB line engraved, I'm sure, and for most of GB postal history stamps and you know, the bulk of that particular Commonwealth even. Where we fall short, I believe, and this is something that I know I brought up at one of the, I can't remember, it's Council or Publications Committee meetings, is that in general, I mean, I could not tell you who collects what in the society unless I've seen them do an article or if I've met them, right? There is no residue or centralized source as to what and I agree entirely with Frank, is that, you know, you've got to be fairly obsessive and focused if you're going to join the Royal, right? On a topic, another topic, the collection that you don't really talk about, but at least when you go to Stampex, you might find something, right? As opposed to what people know you collect. We don't have that resource. So for example, one of the articles that I've got in the pipeline at the moment is about a French formula card produced for Madagascar, or a particular little island off the coast of Madagascar. Well, as I sit in front of my laptop and go through the pre-edit, I have no idea who would be an appropriate peer reviewer. Now, I'll ask around and someone will come up with names and things like that, but it would be nice, and I think it would be advantageous for others to actually sort of to know what people collect, and that's possibly another route where the risk, especially in niche areas of research, of there being some plagiarism, and some of that plagiarism may even be not by design, right, but actually taking it from an article published by a less diligent author, let's say, is to weed those things out. But I would think that in general, the peer reviewer, I hope, would say, well, hang on, seen this, this is not original, or this particular section isn't original.
I must also add that this has never been a problem in the LP. Say never, rarely has been a problem in the LP. You know, it's not something I've ever really encountered as people objecting to this.
In fact, Charles just raised a point on the chat about future members should be invited to identify the collecting interests. Well, apparently they do, because since I've sort of had access to the information, I know that when the membership applications come through, there is an indication of what people collect. What happens to that information, and obviously it can change over the years. I don't know.
That's an entirely different subject, which I'm not going to address.
No. Did you not see the parentheses?
I'm going to move on. Right. I'm now going to talk about scanning. Okay. You've got a beautiful item on your desk. It might be a stamp, it might be a cover, and that wants to form part of the illustrations that are going to go to Tony. What do you do? Well, we start off with assuming that everything's done at 300 DPI or PPI, if you want to call it that. And that's the default. So the vast majority of material which will appear in the LP will be scanned at 300 dots per inch. If you just bung it on your scanner, and if you can just make it a bit straight by de-skewing it, that'd be great. Otherwise, please leave it to Tony, who will make his own mind up as to how close he wants the margins to be cut. If you do put stamps, particularly ones with perforations, please put a piece of black card behind it before you scan it. It just makes life so much easier for the editor to actually lift that and put it into an article. So this would be straight off the scanner. So I'll just pick something off my desk, and that happened to be something that I bought a couple of weeks ago. And I just threw it onto the scanner, almost literally, and press go. And that's what I ended up with. So what do? First thing I do is de-skew it. So I'm just drawing a line horizontally and hitting the de-skew button on my software. And I end up with something which looks straight, or straighter than it was. What I then do is just make it a bit smaller. I crop it ready to send off to the LP editor. And then it's down to the editor's decision to work out how tightly to crop those margins. So if you can see, that's how I left it, and that's maybe how Tony did it. If it's a cover, then we might end up with square edges if the actual shape of the cover isn't really important to the article. If you've got perforations, it's quite a challenge for the editorial scalpel to work out whether you crop it within an inch of its life or whether you actually leave a reasonable amount of space. And this one, if you can go back, oops, where's it gone? You can see this one's actually rouletted top and bottom, but they're actually straight cut sides. So it's down to the skill of the editor to make his own mind up how much he wants to tighten it. Scanning for details, and this is sometimes where we actually run into problems. You start off by most things, if they're going to appear life size or reduced in the LP page, 300 dpi is absolutely fine. And if anything, if people start scanning at 600 or 1200, the files get so big that they become difficult to email around the world. And of course, don't forget that the vast majority of physical printers, when I say printers, I mean a device that puts ink on paper, doesn't actually print any more finely than 300 dpi anyway. So even if you've got a 600 dpi scan, you're not going to get a better result when you put ink on paper. So this is where it gets a bit more tricky. If you want to enlarge something to blow it up, and if you want people to try and understand the precise details, then you do need to scan at a higher resolution. So if you want to blow it up twice life size on the LP printed page, then you need to scan at twice as many dots, i.e. 600 dpi. If you're going to make it much bigger in the LP on the printed page, then you need to multiply by the same factor. What I've done, oh sorry, I do need to put this warning out. I've no idea what you're looking at on your screen today. I don't know whether your screen is, it's an iPad, your screen's going to be what, 15 centimeters wide. I've been to Mike Ilkley Robert's house, and he's got a massive screen about the size of your telly. And so clearly it'll be bigger on his monitor. Or indeed, some people might be looking at it on a phone. I don't know what you're looking at. So please understand that what you're looking at isn't necessarily going to tell the story as I'd like you to see it. I've got one stamp. I pulled this out of one of my collections, which I have barely blown the dust off for decades. But it's a Queen Victoria, plate 11, in red, sadly not black, and it's OA re-entry. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the stamp, you'll see that there's some red marks next to the left-hand side of the letter A in the bottom right-hand corner box. And those images you're looking at are actually 5 different scans. Okay, 300, 600, 1200, 24 and 4800 dpi. Now, I defy anybody looking at those images to tell the difference between them. Yeah, which sort of makes the point. If you're scanning at 300 dpi and you want it to be the same size, then it doesn't matter. Why waste your time doing it 600 or above when the image looks absolutely the same? Don't bother, 300 is good enough. However, if you're now trying to enlarge it, and these are double the size of the previous one, you can begin to see it's a bit clearer on the right-hand side than it is on the left-hand side. And if you go a bit bigger, you'll see it again and again. And now can you see that, is there one more? Yes, there's one more. And you can just, this really does make the point I'm trying to get across. On the left-hand side, it was 300 dpi just stretched. But on the right-hand side, when you enlarge it, you can actually still see the letter A quite clearly. And you can see the re-entry marks, which is those red blobs to the left-hand side of the letter A. So if you're doing it life size or smaller, 300 dpi is fantastic. Otherwise, you need to crank up your scanner. Tony will help you or hold your hand through all that if you need any more advice. When you submit an article to the LP, to the editor rather, we want every image as a separate file. It should be TIFF by choice. The reason I used to say TIFF is that if you've got a non-professional scanner, somebody who doesn't do it for a living, they don't quite know how to handle JPEGs. And some system software does compress JPEGs. And what you're doing, although the scanner still tells you it's 300 dpi, it actually scrunches it down a bit and there's not quite enough detail in the JPEG. You can't compress a TIFF. So basically, if you save it as a TIFF straight off your scanner, you can't go wrong. But if you do save as a JPEG, just make sure you select the non-compression option. PNG is another format that's come into in recent years. I still don't see many PNGs, but they do exist. When the LP is printed, it's printed off wet ink, and it's printed in 4 colour separation. To those in the trade, CMYK's, the 4 different colours: cyan, magenta, yellow and black, K for black as opposed to blue. Whereas most domestic printers are actually using RGB, red, green and blue. So if you look in your printer in your office, if there's 3 print heads, it uses RGB. If there are 4 print heads, it uses CMYK. And because we print using 4 colour separation, we have to convert all of the images to CMYK before sending them off to the printers. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not you understand what I'm talking about, and you don't need to do it. But if you want to save the editor a bit of time and you know what you're doing, please convert them to CMYK before you send them. This was the point that David Alford raised about 15 minutes ago, and this came to bite us about 2 years ago now, when Microsoft, in its wisdom, decided to make the world a lot simpler place for everybody. And they were finding that people were putting images into Word documents, and the files were getting very big, and people couldn't then email the documents around. So what they did, they automatically downsized any image in a Word document down to 220 dpi. And this caused chaos to people who knew what they were doing. So somebody would send me a Word document with images placed inside it and expect me to take those out and put them into the LP. Well, yes, but when you take them out again, they're only reduced to 220 dpi. And this means that they're not good enough for printing. Now, there are ways around it, and if you do know what you're doing, you can actually change the default settings in Microsoft Word. And if anybody wants to email me for the instructions, then please do so, and I'll be delighted to give you a few little tips as to whereabouts in MS Word you can change the default. But generally speaking, go back to the top bullet point on that page. Please send every image as a separate file, as a TIFF or a JPEG or a PNG. That way you won't run into problems. Captions. If you look at a recent LP, Jane Mowbray's would be a nice one to look at. There are lots of illustrations, and Jane has got nice succinct captions underneath each illustration, and also it's got a number. And you know, as soon as you allocate your figure numbers to the article, the better off everybody is. And when you start sending the images to Tony, please put that number in the file name so he knows what it is. You know, we don't want a Sheffield sub-office postmark, Sheffield another sub-office postmark. We want figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. So that way Tony doesn't make a mistake and he knows which ones he's looking at. Ideally, the caption should be very short. Sometimes authors actually write 7 or 8 lines as a caption, but to try and read all that does actually detract from reading the article. So if you're reading the article, you don't want to suddenly have to move your eye to top of the next page to actually get the detail of what it is the author's talking about. And the last point is actually really quite important, because the editor can't always put the image in exactly the right place on the page as you would like. You do need to put brackets see figure 12 or something in your text. And then if figure 12 is half a page away, then that doesn't really matter. Okay, so that's one top tip I would give you. This is what we were talking about, peer reviews. And my slides don't actually say exactly what Tony said, so believe Tony, not me. This is what I used to do, all right? So I apologise, Tony, for trodding on your toes here. But normally, I wouldn't send things out. I developed something called Frank's sniff test. What does that mean? Well, what it means is, if I was reading an article on Madagascar postal stationery or whatever, I wouldn't have a clue what that was all about. And if I saw the article and it seemed to be well written and it seemed to be authoritative, and I knew the person who was writing it was a well-known philatelist of that area, I would just publish it. I wouldn't bother trying to get somebody else to peer review it. But, sorry. Yeah, the problem you've got is if if you really do find somebody who knows an awful lot about this subject, the chances are that they're the perceived world expert on this field. And if the new author is challenging that standpoint, then the expert is not necessarily going to welcome that too much. So, you know, you've got to be careful what you do in terms of putting out to peer reviews. But my stance used to be that I would publish something if it made sense to me, but if I got a series of articles or letters coming back into the editor, then I would certainly publish those as well. And then what you've got, and this is what a journal of record is all about, you have a very educated conversation going of people putting alternative views to each other. In fact, Tony's got a particular case at the moment where we've had a couple of retorts come back into articles. It's all about the 7th of May usage of Tuppenny Blues. It's that sort of thing where we've had one or two people write back into the magazine just saying, well, actually, have you thought about this? Or I'm not quite sure that's right because I know this evidence you didn't cite. And that's, to me, is brilliant. It makes the world go round. And if Tony had put that article out for peer review, the chances are that people who was reviewing it wouldn't have known anyway what the other readers wrote back in about. So this is a no-win situation in my mind. The important thing is, if anybody does challenge what's been published, then you should publish those letters as well, which I used to do. And I know Tony does from evidence recently. Right. This is a very long subject, which Charles is going to talk about in a few weeks' time. But I'm going to very dangerously try and summarize this in 2 sentences. Basically, the author retains copyright, but we do ask the author to confirm to the society that what they've got, we are allowed to publish. And there are some author agreements. The key thing there is if appropriate. You know, if you are writing in saying that the society is going to close on Christmas Eve, then we don't really need a copyright disclosure for that particular piece in the LP, if it's only 2 lines long. But equally, if it's a massive article from somebody who Tony doesn't know, might not even be a member, then Tony will seek a standard author agreement. And that information, the copyright statement in particular, is written by Charles Oppenheim, who's one of the world's, sorry, let me give his title, Professor Charles Oppenheim, who's a professor of copyright at a big university in the UK. And he wrote a very definitive document about copyright. And it is now in full on the Royal's website. And if you've got any questions whatsoever, ask Charles, not me. Right, what do you do when you're finished? The first thing I always do is ask somebody to read it. It doesn't mean to say they need to be a philatelist. In fact, very often you're so close to a very specialized subject that you're not making any sense at all because you assume people know what you know. So, you know, I won't say give it your mother to read, but on the other hand, if your mum doesn't understand it, then chances are somebody else won't either. So give it somebody else to read before you submit it to the editor. When you've had that review yourself, then send off the text and images as separate files to Tony, best by email. But if the files are big, then we just generally recommend using WeTransfer. If you don't know what WeTransfer is, it's a completely free service where you can shift massive files around the internet, and they're all very secure. I've never heard of anything going wrong with WeTransfer, and I find it very effective. And that's it from me.
Frank, could I firstly thank you very much. Covered all of the bases and more. The other thing just about submitting an article that I want to just put out there is if you have an idea for an article, then I'm always happy to have that run by me. Or if you have not, for whatever reason, ever put an article together. I mean, you've got the style guide, but I'm really happy to discuss your ideas and hopefully give you some advice, or maybe even direct you to somebody who I think can also give you some advice. And adding to the other thing that also comes into the peer review is I've just had as it happened, an article was sent to me on the topic of well, it was actually on Korean stamp design. Korea tends to be one of my areas of interest, but I'm fairly niche and it's mainly postal history. And I felt the article was, to use a technical term, a little bit clunky in that it's the sort of thing that you might find in an undergrad's paper or something like that. And it just didn't read to me like an article that would get other people reading it, let's say. And I therefore had it peer reviewed, and I had it peer reviewed by somebody who is got a fairly broad expertise in article writing, and the author was overjoyed, really, because as Frank was saying, we want to communicate, and sometimes it's just a question of some basic moving around words, a bit of grammar, and maybe a little bit of tightening up. But you may have something that you're reticent in putting forward because either you think it doesn't say enough, or it doesn't say it the way you actually wanted to say it, or whatever, or some additional information would perhaps improve it in your very, very high, to your very high standards. Don't let that put you off. We can operate a triage system here. Sometimes it won't convince you to publish, but hopefully it will. And just don't set yourself timings necessarily, because it's difficult to actually set how long these things can take. But yeah, it's part of the editorial service.
Just acknowledge Charles's comment. He's not a professor of hard sums after all.
There are a couple of questions which are lurking around, though. One from Malcolm Groom and one, I think, from Simon Martin Redmond. So has Malcolm got a question?
Good one. Yeah, that is a good one.
Well, since he's gone quiet, who owns the copyright to a scan taken of an item when it was in your collection but has since been disposed of?
There's good. I can just cite English law, and I use my words very carefully. It's not British law, it's English law. And there are several test cases in this. The judges decided that there is no copyright in a scan. You can copyright photographs, but you can't copyright scans. The argument put forward was that there is skill in making a photograph, and the photographer retains, therefore, some responsibility and ownership of the image. But on scanning, English precedent is that there is no copyright in a scan. I've no idea what Australian law says, Malcolm, I'm sorry. You're muted, Malcolm. Hit your space bar.
You there, Malcolm?
Put your finger on your space bar, Malcolm, and then talk.
No, I'm not. I've got it on now, but it wasn't working before. Sorry, Frank. Yeah, that answers my question. It's interesting because I've got a lot of scans of things I used to own, but no longer own. And I was wondering what the rules were, what the law says. But I'm pretty sure it's the same as British law.
Yeah, you can use those.
Yeah.
And then,
is it possible, Frank, and I hope it's not, for third parties to acquire a copy of that scan because somebody put it on a website or gave a scan away? I suspect the scan and the right to use it is with the person who made the scan.
I think that's a good interpretation. The best example of this is using images from the collection of Her Majesty the Queen. And if you ever are able to get a scan out of the Royal Collection, the Royal Philatelic Collection, they insist that you use the phrase image reproduced by gracious permission of Her Majesty the Queen to whom copyright belongs. I think I've quoted that exactly.
That's pretty much right. That's close enough.
Yeah, and what Michael Seffi used to say is that he really wanted to control the image quality of reproduction. He didn't mind people like the LP reproducing, because he knew that we would give a very robust quality control on the image. You know, we get the color right, for example. But if you were to just produce it on a black and white photocopier, which some specialist study circles used to do, then Michael was very reluctant to give permission to reuse it. So pinching images off the internet is always fraught with danger. And in fact, I can see Charles nodding, and that's one of the biggest problems we have in the publishing world. And that is actually what the author agreement that we mentioned earlier, and John Cox actually was responsible for putting this wording together. So thank you, John. We do ask people to sign to say that they do own the image rights. In other words, they are telling the Royal that yes, the images I've given to you, I have checked that I have got the permission from the owners of the copyright to use it. And that's one of the reasons that we do actually now ask for these author agreements to be signed. It's much more important when you were doing a book, by the way, where you can have hundreds, if not thousands of images in books. But it does apply in LP articles as well. And that's where the editor's discretion comes in for whether or not he does ask you to sign an author agreement.
I think that the remark about the downloading images off the internet is very important. You should not assume that you are entitled to use any image of any part of the internet, because it may well be owned by a third party. So you really do have to try and find out who owns the image, not where it happens to be displayed on some web page.
It's interesting. There are now people who collect just images. They don't collect stamps, especially more valuable items. They have collections of images.
Can I move us on from this? There is another question from Renichi Yamada, who said, and it's a question I've been asked frequently, you said language for the LP is UK English. Could you recommend some good book for philatelic terms in UK English? I have a philatelic term illustrated by philatelic terms illustrated by Stanley Gibbons, but I think it's not good enough.
Sorry, I think it's a very good book, but very simple for, so it's very, so beginners. So I think, sorry, I'm Renichi Yamada, and I think, so for London Philatelist, so article is very high level. So for high level articles, I think philatelic terms illustrated by Stanley Gibbons is not enough. So you can recommend a good book for philatelic terms. So could you let me know?
I think what my advice would be, if you try and express yourself the best you can, using whatever words you come up with, then the editor will actually correct it if it needs correcting or improve it. Forgive me, I don't know if Jack Sang's still on the call. He was earlier. And one of the biggest problem I have is actually putting into English people who write natively in the Chinese language, because you don't have definite and indefinite articles in the Chinese language. And you're forever putting the word "a" or "the" in prose, which has been written by somebody who speaks Chinese natively. And it's that sort of thing which I was referring to. In terms of philatelic terms, you know, I don't think there is an English term for tekbesh. I'd love to find one. And that's the sort of expression I think you're asking for. Sometimes you don't get them. But the editor will intervene if he feels clarification is needed normally.
In fact, apropos that, the article I was referring to that had been submitted while Seyu was the editor, part of the delay was actually one Italian term to try and find an English equivalent, and that took even going through our Italian representative and the various other RDPs and people like that. It took 3 months, but we got that.
I mean, I've just got one which is from Danish, in which there's a line between stamps which is a piece of leading separating the cliches. And in some of the stamps it prints, and in some of the stamps it doesn't. It shouldn't. But what's it called when it does?
It's called a king.
Frame line.
The prosecution rests. And sometimes, I mean, Beata is muttering in my ear, sometimes there isn't an English equivalent. It's extremely difficult. And Frank's advice, I think, is by miles the most practical.
I've actually now, I've actually stopped talking to my slides. I brought the chat up. Simon Martin raised something ages ago, which is really important. I'll just read it out. It says, I tend to send a PDF of the whole article as well to show how I envisaged it looking. I haven't mentioned it. Is it useful? It is fantastic when authors do that. It really is helpful because it just helps the editor typeset the whole piece. So yes, please, if you can do that, great. And if you can't do that, you can put the images in Word documents. But please make sure you send copies of separate files as well if you do that.
Thank you, Frank.
Hi, Frank. Hi, Frank and Charles.
Hi, Jack.
I have a question. You know, sometimes I take, for example, I take photograph in Postal Museum or V&A, right? Just, the image, for example, the whole sheet of the penny black. I take photograph and then can I use it in my book?
You will you will own the copyright of the photograph.
Yeah, that's right.
There are image rights associated with what the museum holds. And funnily enough, I go back to what I was describing about Her Majesty, where Michael Seffi would not want you to put a photograph in of something you took on your phone of something which is in Her Majesty's collection. And the same is true of most big institutions, whether it be the Postal Museum or the British Library or Her Majesty's collection. These people do not like it if you basically just take images at random, because they cannot control the image, the way in which the image is reproduced. So you must seek permission to include those things. And you certainly must cite where it came from anyway.
Most museums, major museums, actually say that you may take photographs for personal use and not for commercial purposes. If you want, for example, to put it in a book, then you have to go back to them, and if it's a book that is likely to be profitable, they will charge you a substantial sum to use a photograph of an object. And it's quite common, for example, the Science Museum will refuse you the right to use your own image and will insist that you purchase the rights to use an image that they supply and which usually was taken as the accession photograph.
And the same is true of material held by the Royal. I know Nicola gets asked regularly for images from whether it be the Perkins Bacon archive or a particular die in the museum or whatever. And we are constantly being asked for material of that nature. And the Royal itself has a policy, but the Royal doesn't charge members of the Royal a reproduction fee if the Royal's going to publish a book about it.
One particular bête noire of mine in the area of plagiarism, I've collected for many, many years postmarks and earliest and last known dates. And these are very popular area of study across the globe. I've collected them for probably 40 years for one country, and I know every date that I have got as earliest and last known, where I got it from. Far too many books use both copied images of postmarks and, for frankly, pillaged lists of earliest and last known dates, reproduced with no reference to the source. Those dates are the fact that someone perhaps has put them in a book. You have to acknowledge where the dates have come from.
Yeah. Yes, unfortunately, there was a test case in America on this, and the APRL got involved, and it was concluded that you cannot copyright the earliest and last dates of a particular postmark. What you can copyright is the way in which you laid it out in the book you published.
No,
you cannot copyright the information though.
Can I just draw this this piece to order, because we're straying over into Charles's.
Oh, true. Yes.
Presentation, and we're going way off topic. Can I just say what I'm proposing to do is to say we've lost about 20% of our audience since Frank finished his presentation. I'm going to wrap up the formal part of this at 3:30, which is quite soon. So that'll be the end of that. But if you want to stay on and chew around some other issues, preferably keeping off subjects which we're returning to in future weeks, we'll carry on going until everybody gets bored and disappears. Rather like that surprise quartet, is it Haydn, where everybody sneaks off stage and eventually there's nobody left. So 3:30 we're going to stop the shop, and then we'll just carry on while we've got an audience.